CO2 caps are when lawmakers establish a limit or cap on the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted within a year. The main goal is to reduce carbon dioxide levels from the burning of fossil fuels. According to scientists, the limit might be relatively loose in the beginning as the economy starts to adjust, but it must become strict in order to achieve the emissions reductions that are essential to control global warming. Cap and trade creates incentives for businesses and households to conserve energy, improve energy efficiency, and adopt clean energy technologies. In this way, it places a price on carbon, which encourages these entities to figure out how to cut their fossil fuel energy costs. As a consequence, the demand for fossil fuels would decrease. California and several northeastern states formed the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They have all individually implemented a regional cap-and-trade system. In 2005, the European Union began operating a cap-and-trade system. In 2009, the American Clean Energy and Security Act was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. However, the U.S. Senate has not passed a climate change bill. Absent congressional action, the Environmental Protection Agency could step in and regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act.
A primary community benefit would be the overall reduction of greenhouse gases in the environment, which would create safer, healthier communities across the nation. However, in creating a healthier environment, it causes some individual companies to suffer higher costs because they might have to change their method for creating their goods and services. And with their change in goods and services comes a community cost as well. Some communities may see a higher increase in taxes as well as an increase in overall consumer prices, which some American households may not be able to afford. Individual companies may also benefit from CO2 caps under proposed plans. For example, one plan involves giving companies allowances for their reduction in CO2 emissions. If some companies are able to reduce their emissions cheaply, they are able to keep those allowances and sell them to other companies and gain a profit.
The strive to limit CO2 emissions has been an ongoing issue in politics, interest groups, and most recently, the automotive industry. In the early 90s, CO2 emissions reached a peak of 6,023 million metric tons per year. Due to economic and population expansion, as well as an increase in consumption of coal and petroleum fuels, new drilling techniques were developed. Also, federal policies such as the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 were implemented, which helped expand and improve renewable energy efficiency. CO2 emissions is not only an issue in the United States, but worldwide. The European Commission has been pushing for the limitation of the CO2 emission through the automotive industry. The limitation of CO2 emissions in the automotive industry not only helps the environment with their clean fuel efficiency, but are affordable. So in many ways, they help the economy too.
California, the issue is that a small environmental justice group called the Association of Irritated Residents has a problem with California's AB 32 climate program due to the fact that the carbon trading programs allow individual big dirty facilities in low-income areas to stay open and keep polluting given the condition that they continue to buy carbon permits. Although these small groups of irritated residents have their grievances, the mercy of implementing the caps and trade program is ultimately setting a precedent to improve the great majority, provide reliable markets for a source of clean energy, and possibly influence the course of national or international climate policy. These justice groups object to facilities buying of carbon permits that allow them to pollute in the low-income areas rather than utilizing methods of lowering emissions, fuel switching, or shutting down. The mercy of the cap and trade sets a limit on emissions by presenting an incentive for facilities to lower the amount of pollutants released by means of purchasing a permit. The more emissions that are released, the expensive it is for industries. With that, in order to lower costs, industries can plan and build a gradual and predictable schedule which allows for future regulations that will be followed.
Proponents of the cap-and-trade system would say that the short-term benefit would be to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions that are now currently still steadily increasing in our environment. In order to help stabilize these concentrations, cuts in emissions, especially CO2 emissions, must begin within the next couple years in order to avoid long-term permanent damage. However, opponents would argue that there is a cost associated with short-term, this being an unnecessary financial burden on taxpayers. It's estimated that implementing the system would cost between $263 and $366 billion annually. This cost would fall on taxpayers and especially low-income families who would be paying for a disproportionate share of the cost. However, in the long term, proponents would argue that the benefit is decreased greenhouse gas emissions as well as a viable solution for environmental threats. If effective policies are implemented, it's projected that greenhouse gas emissions would decrease by 2/3 by 2050 and 80% by 2070. In addition, this would lead to better energy efficiency and symbolize a shift towards low carbon and non-carbon energy sources such as solar sources and wind sources. However, again, opponents argue that there's a cost associated with the long term, this being the perpetuation of the financial burden for taxpayers and consumers. It's estimated that $600 billion would go into implementing and also running the cap and trade system within the U.S.